This is a World War II scenario where Russia invades Western Europe and America doesn't help. Let me explain. The year is 1943. The tide of war in Europe has decisively turned against the Axis powers. It's only a matter of time before Germany surrenders. But in Moscow, Joseph Stalin is growing increasingly anxious. As the Red Army pushes west, it hasn't gone as smoothly as he would have hoped. And even worse, the Allies haven't opened up a second front as he demanded they do. This failure to relieve Soviet pressure is costing countless lives, and Stalin is running out of patience. He needs a plan B, something to force the Allies to come to his rescue or crush his enemies once and for all. Enter Operation Unthinkable. This was a secret plan that Stalin drew up with his top generals. It called for the Soviet Union to invade Western Europe and capture Berlin before the end of the war. To make matters worse, Stalin decided to keep the plan a secret from the other members of the Grand Alliance. When Churchill and Roosevelt met with Stalin at the Tehran Conference in late 1943, the subject of a second front never came up. Churchill had already drawn up plans for an invasion of Europe in 1944. But those plans were put on hold when it became clear that the Soviets could undivert enough troops away from the Eastern Front to support a full-scale invasion. Stalin, however, never mentioned that the reason he could unopen up a Western Front was because he was planning to lead one himself. But things didn't go according to plan. The Allies defeated the Germans at Normandy and pushed them back across France. But the Soviet advance in the east slowed to a halt. By the time Operation Bagration was complete, the Red Army had pushed the Germans as far west as they could. Even Stalin began to realize that forcing the Allies to open up a second front was futile. And so he began to make peace with his situation. In August 1944, he finally agreed to let the British and Americans take the lead in any future operations in Western Europe. As the war wound down in Europe, Stalin prepared his forces for one final push to Berlin. But then something unthinkable happened. The Germans launched a massive counterattack in the Ardennes forest. They nearly succeeded in splitting the Allies' lines of communication, and might have done so if not for the last-minute relief of that. But this near defeat shook Stalin to his core. He realized that the war in Europe could drag on 4 years. If he did undo something drastic, there was still time to get his army into Western Europe before the Allies could finish off the Germans. So Stalin made a fateful decision. On December 27, 1944, Soviet forces crossed into Austria, quickly overwhelming the small Austrian army. Within days, they had advanced deep into the country. But Stalin wasn't satisfied with just taking Austria. He wanted to break into Germany itself and capture Berlin before the Allies. His generals pleaded with him to slow down, warning that his army wasn't ready for such a massive undertaking. But Stalin was determined to succeed where his allies had failed. At this point, the Soviet army numbered around 8 million men, making it by far the largest fighting force in the world. But there were severe limitations on how Stalin could employ his army. Unlike the Red Army of 1941, which had swept through Eastern Europe with little regard for logistics, Stalin now understood the importance of supply. He had learned this lesson the hard way after the disastrous winter of 1941-42, when his army nearly starved to death on the battlefield. To prevent such a disaster from happening again, Stalin ordered his forces to establish strong defensive positions along the entire Eastern Front, believing that Germany was too powerful to be defeated in a single blow. This meant that while millions of Soviet troops were engaged in the fight against Germany, they were mostly tied down to static defensive positions, making it difficult to commit large numbers of troops to a new offensive without exposing his flanks to attack. Another problem facing Stalin was the lack of supplies. The Soviet Union was a huge country, and getting supplies to his army in the West would be a logistical nightmare. But these problems paled in comparison to Stalin's most serious challenge, the state of his army. While the Soviet Union did produce more tanks and aircraft than any other nation during the war, the quality of their equipment lagged behind the West. German tanks were generally faster and better armed than their Soviet counterparts, and the same was true of their aircraft. But what Stalin lacked in quality, he made up for in quantity. And while the Soviet Air Force didn't have as many advanced fighter planes as the Germans, they did have one major advantage: the long-range bomber. This would prove to be a decisive factor in the battle for Berlin. Stalin divided his forces into 3 groups. The first group, under the command of Georgy Zhukov, would strike north from Vienna towards Berlin. The second group, under the command of Vasily Chukov, would drive south from Budapest. And the third group, under the command of Konstantin Rokas, would cross the Karantsebs and push straight for the city. Each group consisted of between 200 and 300,000 troops, along with several thousand tanks and artillery pieces. But Stalin did not tell his generals the real reason why he was committing so many resources to this plan. He believed that if he could just get his army into Germany, the German leadership would collapse and the war would be over before the Allies could do anything about it. In fact, Stalin was hoping for nothing less than a total collapse of the German military and government. A coup d'etat, which would bring Germany into the Soviet sphere of influence. As we know, however, the German leadership remained steadfast until the very end. On April 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, and the German army continued to fight for another 2 weeks. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The Soviet victory parade in Moscow celebrated this momentous occasion. But in the West, there were sour grapes. Churchill and Truman were furious about being kept in the dark. They felt that Stalin had stolen their victory, and they were Unteba to let him get away with it. In the Potsdam Agreement, the victorious Allies divided Germany into 4 occupation zones, but it was clear to everyone that Stalin had violated the spirit of the agreement. He had taken too much territory for himself, and he showed no signs of letting up. In fact, Stalin had already set his sights on a new target, Austria. With the war in Europe over, the United States and Britain had fewer than 2 million troops stationed in the region. But Stalin had already deployed over 1 million Soviet soldiers to Austria. It was clear to everyone that Stalin was preparing to annex the country. And this time, the Allies wouldn't stand for it. In response to Stalin's aggression, the United States and Britain took the unprecedented step of recognizing the Provisional Government of Austria. This was a clear violation of the post-war territorial agreements, and Stalin was furious. He responded by kicking off the most massive wave of deportations in history. Over the course of the next few days, Soviet troops rounded up hundreds of thousands of Austrians and deported them to Siberia. Entire villages were wiped off the map and their homes were given to incoming Soviet settlers. The Americans and British were outraged by Stalin's actions, and they prepared to intervene. But before they could do anything, the Russians struck. On March 1946, Soviet forces invaded Austria. The Austrians put up a fierce resistance, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. Within days, Vienna had fallen, and the Austrians had no choice but to surrender. The United States and Britain were horrified by what they were seeing. They had been completely caught off guard, and they didn't have the resources to mount an effective defense. In fact, the only reason that they had been attacked yet was because Stalin didn't want to risk starting a wider conflict. With Austria secured, Stalin turned his attention to the next target, West Germany. Again, the Allies were caught off guard. They had no idea that Stalin was planning to invade until it was too late. Soviet troops poured into West Germany, and the Allies were forced to retreat. One by one, their positions were overrun, and they were pushed back to the coast. By May 1946, all of Western Germany was under Soviet control. The Allies had lost, and there was nothing they could do about it. But Stalin wasn't finished yet. He turned his attention to the rest of Europe. Over the next few months, the Soviet Union would invade and occupy all of Western Europe, including France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. In fact, Stalin was planning to invade Italy as well. But before he could do anything, the Russians struck. On March 1947, Soviet nuclear weapons devastated the cities of Paris and London. The United States and Britain were completely caught off guard. They had no idea that Stalin was planning to invade until it was too late. It was a bold move, but it may have just worked. Now the alliance is broken. American and British leaders are scrambling to figure out what to do. Do they try to fight back? Do they try to negotiate with Stalin? Or do they do nothing and hope that the Russians will eventually get bored and give up? Whatever they decide to do, the future of Europe and possibly the entire world hangs in the balance. And that's why you should subscribe for part 2.